You are not ready to hear this about Chuck Norris, the man the world treated like a living legend, the face of strength, the symbol of unbreakable American toughness, a man surrounded by myths, larger-than-life stories, and an image so powerful it seemed untouchable. But what if that image was hiding something far darker? What if behind the iron stare, the Hollywood glory, and the myth of invincibility, there was a private drama the public was never meant to fully see? Today, I am not giving you the polished version, the tribute version, or the safe version. Today, we are going behind the curtain, behind the fame, behind the legend, into the part of the story where pain, betrayal, silence, and devastating choices begin to surface. Why did his final message sound so unusually quiet? What was really happening while the world kept believing in the image of a man who could never be broken? And who was still standing beside him when that carefully built legend began to crack? This story has everything: hidden tensions, uncomfortable truths, quiet betrayals, and shocking details that never sounded as loud as they should have. Because the story of Chuck Norris may not just be the story of one star, it may be the exposure of an entire system that knows how to build heroes in public, then slowly consume them in private. Watch this video all the way through, because what comes next will change the way you see Chuck Norris forever. The most painful, the most unexpected, and the most revealing part of this story is only beginning. Chuck Norris's final public message did not sound like a challenge, a threat, or one more polished Hollywood performance from a man who had spent decades selling invincibility. It sounded controlled, restrained, almost disarmingly human. No clenched jaw theatrics, no loud self-mythology, no attempt to pose as the untouchable force the world had been trained to expect. And that is where the real story begins. If his last words were this calm, what exactly had he been hiding behind that legendary armor for so many years? For far too long, the public was not given a man. It was given a brand, a symbol, a commercial-grade image of strength. The name Chuck Norris stopped functioning as a biography and started functioning as shorthand. Toughness, discipline, victory, endurance, no visible weakness allowed. But in that final message, the machinery slipped, because in front of the camera, there was no longer a myth on display. There was Carlos Ray Norris, composed and quiet, speaking like someone who had already made peace with truths the public had barely begun to suspect. The most explosive part was not what he attacked, but what he refused to attack. He did not name enemies, did not settle scores, did not stage one last media war against the people and systems that may have drained him for years. He chose gratitude over spectacle, and that choice hit harder than outrage would have. This applies to one of the oldest laws of public life. When a man built into a monument suddenly speaks softly, people start wondering what kind of private storm made silence more powerful than revenge. That is why the final video does not feel like a harmless farewell clip. It feels like a crack running through a 50-year illusion. For decades, the world had been sold a figure who supposedly did not bend, did not break, did not carry visible emotional wreckage. Hollywood liked that version. Audiences found comfort in that version. Internet culture turned that version into endless jokes and exaggerated folklore. But what happens to a person when millions of strangers demand the same mask every single day, year after year? From the outside, the picture looked perfect. A martial arts icon, a film star, a television presence who, across the 1980s and 1990s, came to represent order, discipline, and moral certainty for millions of viewers. Yet the source text points in a far darker direction. Silent battles, pressure from the industry, the burden of having to match an image that gradually stopped protecting him and started trapping him instead. While the public saw a champion dispatching enemies on screen, the private man appears to have been carrying fatigue, grief, restraint, and the exhausting duty to remain strong on command. That is the ugly truth behind celebrity mythology. A mask of strength can begin as protection, turn into success, and then harden into a prison. People wanted one thing from Chuck Norris over and over again: toughness, control, stamina, certainty, no collapse, no trembling, no public vulnerability. And the larger the legend became, the less room remained for the ordinary human being underneath it, the one who may have needed silence more than applause, distance more than praise, and mercy more than admiration. This applies directly to why that final message landed with such force. Viewers were not simply hearing a famous face, they were hearing a man who had been required for decades to behave like an idea rather than a person. That is why the central question becomes unavoidable and brutal. How does someone whose very name became synonymous with resilience manage to conceal unspoken suffering for so long? That question is the engine of the entire story, because from this point on, the issue is no longer fame itself, but the hidden cost of carrying it. And that is where the next turn becomes unavoidable. To understand why his voice carried that much restraint, and why the final words felt heavier than any performance he ever gave, the story has to move backward. Not to the superstar first, but to the frightened boy, long before the cameras, long before the beard, long before the legend. Men do not become emotionally armored by accident. First, they are taught, by hardship, humiliation, family chaos, and survival, to bury pain so deeply that the world later mistakes that burial for strength. Behind the iron idol that half a century of pop culture sold as the pure image of masculine toughness, there was a story Hollywood had every reason to keep off the front page. Audiences liked Chuck Norris as a finished symbol. Stone face, iron will, no weakness visible, no cracks allowed. But every legend has a dirty basement, and this one did too. While viewers applauded the screen warrior, a far uglier truth had been piling up underneath the brand for years. Not confidence, but fear. Not natural dominance, but compressed silence. Not power from birth, but a long habit of enduring humiliation. That is why the phrase "silent battles" should not be treated like decorative drama. It is the key that unlocks the whole mechanism. Behind the famous beard, the hard stare, and the myth of the man no one could bend, there was a boy life had been grinding down long before the cameras arrived. And this is where the most marketable myth falls apart. No, he was not born as the unbeatable force later sold to the world. This applies to the most uncomfortable turn in the story. The louder the world later shouted about his strength, the quieter those early years became in the public memory. And those early years were not heroic at all. They were poor, humiliating, anxious, and emotionally cold. Carlos Ray Norris did not grow up inside the warm lighting of future fame. He grew up under financial strain, instability, and the shadow of a father battling alcoholism. For a child, that means something brutally simple. Home is not always the place where fear stops. When protection is missing early, children learn fast. Do not complain, do not attract attention, do not expect rescue. Then came the cruelty that childhood specializes in. He was shy, awkward, withdrawn, and in a small-town environment, those traits often turn a child into easy prey. Young people can smell vulnerability with frightening speed, and they attack it with the kind of casual brutality adults later sanitize as just growing up. Put plainly, the future icon of strength was mocked, cornered, and stripped of confidence long before he understood what confidence even was. The harshest part is not poverty alone, and not bullying alone. It is the collision of the two. One blow waited at home, another outside it, and in the middle stood a boy no one was grooming to become a symbol of power. The source text states it plainly: timid, victimized, burdened by hardship, and shaped by fear. That is not a side note in the biography. That is the missing foundation without which the later transformation makes no real sense. This applies to the biggest newspaper-style provocation buried inside the narrative. The public was sold a machine, but the truth begins with a frightened child from a poor household, living in the shadow of a drinking father and learning very early what it meant to become a target. Isn't that the real headline? The man later marketed as the embodiment of toughness began as a boy with almost nothing solid to lean on. This is exactly the kind of origin story celebrity culture loves to clean up. The public gets the polished outcome, while everything too pathetic, too human, too painful is pushed out of frame. Nobody likes being reminded that many icons did not rise from glory, but from shame, dread, and household instability. In Chuck Norris's case, this is not sentimental filler. It is the entire base of the structure, because the discipline, hardness, and refusal to show weakness later in life did not grow out of comfort. They grew out of early humiliation and the need to survive it. That is the real conclusion of this passage. This is not a fairy tale about a born titan. It is the story of a child, pressured so early by circumstance that emotional coldness became a survival method before strength became a public image. First, he learned not how to conquer, but how not to fall apart. Only later did the world look at that survival tactic and rename it legend. Before the military, Carlos Ray Norris was exactly the kind of young man the world tends to overlook and rough up without mercy. After the military, the story changed direction so sharply that it almost reads like two different lives stitched together by one name. His service in the United States Air Force pulled him out of the cramped, humiliating reality that had shaped his early years and threw him into a far harsher but far clearer world. South Korea did not simply become a station on a service record. It became the place where a frightened young man began the long process of tearing down one identity and building another from the ground up. That is the real turning point, and it was never about glamour. There were no cameras, no applause, no red carpets waiting for him there. What he found in Korea was not fame, but structure. Not comfort, but order. Not escape, but a discipline so severe and demanding that it forced him to stop seeing himself as a passive target of other people's cruelty. It was there that he encountered Tang Soo Do, and this was no decorative hobby, no exotic pastime to mention later in interviews. It was the first real system that gave him a method to rebuild himself, body first, then mind, then the entire internal code by which he lived. That is why this part of the story matters so much. People like to reduce martial arts stories to kicks, uniforms, tournaments, and surface-level toughness. But for Norris, martial arts were not a collection of techniques. They were an act of rescue. They gave him shape where life had given him confusion. They gave him rules where childhood had given him instability. They gave him self-command where fear had long been in control. The great public misunderstanding came later, when millions saw only the hard outer shell and failed to notice what that shell had actually been built to protect. This applies to the central transformation in the entire biography. The shy, wounded boy did not suddenly disappear through magic. He was replaced piece by piece through repetition, discipline, and a ruthless refusal to remain weak in the way life had once defined weakness for him. In Korea, under the pressure of military service and martial training, Norris began forging the quality that would later define his entire public myth: control. Not loud aggression, not cheap swagger, but control over movement, fear, posture, silence, reaction, and eventually identity itself. And that is where the real rebirth begins. By the time he left Korea, he was no longer walking through the world in the same psychological skin. He had found a language stronger than humiliation. He had found a code stronger than self-doubt. He had discovered that discipline could do what sympathy never had. It could make a man feel solid inside his own life. This was not yet Hollywood, but it was something more important. It was the end of being available for defeat. When he returned to the United States, he did not come back as the same Carlos people once could have dismissed or ignored. He came back with the kind of internal certainty that changes the entire trajectory of a life. He began building martial arts schools, and even that detail matters more than it may seem at first glance. A man who had once been searching for his own foundation was now creating structure for others. That is not just career progress, that is a total reversal of social position. The one who once needed protection was becoming the one who taught strength. This is also the point where the legend people later called Chuck Norris truly begins to take shape. Not on a film set, not in a publicity office, not in the artificial light of celebrity culture. It begins in the much harder place where a man decides that no one else gets to define him anymore. The world would later see the beard, the stare, the controlled violence on screen, the myth of the invincible American fighter. But the real origin of that figure lies much earlier, in a military posting overseas, in endless training, in discipline repeated until it became character, and in the private vow of a man who had decided he would never again live at the mercy of fear. If newspapers wanted the bluntest possible version of this transformation, the headline would be simple: "A bullied boy entered Korea. A weaponized will came out." No miracle, no fairy tale, no sudden gift from destiny. Just hardship, training, repetition, and a brutal reassembly of the self. That was the real birth of Chuck Norris. Not the first movie, not the first fame, but the moment the frightened child finally lost control of the story to the man who had built his own armor and intended to keep it. When Chuck Norris returned to America, he did not merely keep training, and he did not merely open a few martial arts schools. He began building a zone of influence, and that is the point where the story stops being private. The man who had once been searching for structure for himself was now creating structure for others. His growing network of academies made him visible, then valuable, and finally irresistible to Hollywood, a machine that has always known how to spot the moment discipline can be turned into profit, and a person can be turned into a marketable symbol. From there, the rise moved with the kind of speed people later like to romanticize as destiny, even though it was far more calculated and far more brutal than that. The world truly noticed Norris when he appeared in The Way of the Dragon and stepped into the Roman Colosseum opposite Bruce Lee. That was not just a fight scene, and it was not just a memorable cameo. It was the first moment millions saw that there was something unusually controlled, silent, and unnervingly real about him. Set against the louder, more theatrical personalities of the era, Norris almost looked provocative in his restraint. No excess noise, no clownish swagger, no cheap self-display. That was the core of his impact. He was not selling emotional fireworks, he was selling control. And very quickly, that control became the most valuable thing he brought to the screen. This applies to the precise moment the man became a national-scale commodity. Hollywood did not simply see a martial arts expert. It saw a rare combination: discipline, severity, near-religious seriousness, and the face of someone who seemed to know more about pain than he was willing to say. That kind of image landed perfectly in an America that wanted men on screen who did not hesitate, did not overtalk, and did not collapse into self-doubt, but arrived already carrying the authority of decision. By the late 1970s, he had become a leading man, and that was no fluke. Films like Good Guys Wear Black gave audiences a figure who felt less polished than most studio-made stars, and therefore more believable. Norris carried himself less like a manufactured celebrity and more like a man who had dragged himself out of an earlier life by force of will. That is why his screen image worked on a deeper level than the average action role. Viewers were not only watching a fighter, they were watching a man who never asked for pity and therefore commanded respect. Then came 1984 and Missing in Action, and the myth expanded dramatically. To general audiences, It looked like a hard, profitable, muscular war picture. But the source text ties the film to something much more personal, a tribute to his younger brother Wieland, who was lost in Vietnam. And that is exactly the kind of twist newspapers love. The moment commercial success turns out to be carrying private grief underneath its box office surface. That creates the kind of paradox the public rarely notices in real time. While viewers saw an assured fighter on screen, Norris may well have been channeling personal loss, guilt, memory, and unprocessed sorrow through the role itself. Every blow, every grim expression, every hard march through the plot registered as genre entertainment. But inside that entertainment, if the source text is even half right in spirit, something else was happening. A man was converting grief into performance because Hollywood has never known what to do with pain unless it can package it as spectacle. This applies to the most uncomfortable secret of his fame. The louder the posters shouted, the quieter the real emotional engine behind that image remained. People thought they were buying strength. In truth, they were buying disciplined sorrow, tightly sealed inside the body of a hero who always moved forward. Then came Walker, Texas Ranger, and at that point Norris stopped being merely an action star. He entered millions of homes as a symbol of moral order. For nearly a decade, he was not just a television lawman, and not just the man who punished villains by the end of the episode. He became a weekly figure of comfort, a familiar face of justice, an image of an older America where good did not over-explain itself, where a man kept his word, and where evil could still be stopped by fists, principle, and inner code. That is where his career outgrew filmography and became archetype. Chuck Norris turned into an image that functioned even without a specific plot attached to it. His name began to mean more than roles. Resilience, control, invulnerability, blunt justice, masculine steadiness without panic. And when the internet in the early 2000s transformed him into the subject of endless legends and exaggerated folklore, the myth finally separated from the living man and became its own engine of popular culture. That is why describing his path as just a successful acting career misses the point entirely. He traveled from instructor and martial arts master to something close to a global folk symbol, recognizable even in places where people might not remember specific titles. To audiences, he became an embodiment of American endurance, almost an export product of strength itself. And that was the trap hidden inside the triumph. The higher Chuck Norris rose as a cultural sign, the father Carlos Ray Norris, the brother, the husband, the private man carrying old pain, disappeared from public view. At the peak of fame, Chuck Norris seemed to possess everything Hollywood teaches people to worship: recognition, box office value, television authority, national symbol status, and the kind of public adoration that starts to look almost religious. But this is where the story makes its ugliest turn. What looked from the outside like the final triumph of a man who had beaten life at its own game was from the inside becoming something far more claustrophobic. A carefully padded cage built out of expectations, contracts, and the appetites of an industry that never stops feeding. The public saw a powerful figure who seemed to need neither rest, nor pity, nor the right to be fragile. The studio saw something even more convenient. Not Carlos Ray Norris, not a man with a past, not a grieving brother, a husband, a martial artist, or a private person. They saw a mechanism, profitable, disciplined, reliable, capable of delivering the same controlled stare, the same force, the same moral certainty on demand. And that was the central fraud buried under the success. The larger the myth grew, the less room remained for the living human being trapped inside it. At first, the armor helped him. It protected him, hid older wounds, kept people away from what he had spent years refusing to expose. But Hollywood has a special kind of hunger. This factory does not know how to love an image. It knows how to drain one. And so the very shell he had built to avoid ever being broken again gradually began turning into a private prison. The thing that once defended him now started confining him. This applies to the point where protection stops functioning as protection and begins functioning as punishment. While millions admired his invulnerability, the industry was quietly insisting that he remain exactly that way forever. No breakdowns, no exhaustion, no right to suddenly say that enough was enough. What was required from him was not growth, but repetition, not personal truth, but a stable product. The harshest part began when Norris tried to step outside his own myth. According to the source text, he wanted more serious dramatic material, roles that reflected the complexity of his life, his spiritual path, and the emotional weight he had been carrying. But those doors were quickly shut. The system wanted the same stone-faced hero again and again, not a man with too much unspoken reality inside him. That is where the crude machinery of the system becomes impossible to ignore. While the press and audiences celebrated the next installment of the image, producers and executives, as the source text frames it, were tightening control more and more. Restrictive contracts, minimal room for creative risk, almost no freedom for personal expression, not an actor, but an asset, not a person, but an asset with a beard, ratings, and a recognizable kick. This is why fame so often behaves less like a reward and more like a debt trap with gold trim. The more the audience becomes attached to the image, the more expensive any deviation becomes for the person living inside it. One wrong move and the machine starts getting nervous. One unwanted project and you are reminded what the structure depends on. One visible hint of human vulnerability and suddenly the people around you either want to push you back into line or replace you with someone younger, easier, and more obedient. This applies to the most sophisticated form of pressure of all, when a person is required not merely to work, but to perform himself without interruption. Not just a hero in film, but a hero in life. Invulnerable, quiet, composed, always available, always inspiring, never complaining. For the public, that looked noble. For the man himself, it was becoming a psychological cell in which every genuinely human impulse had to be strangled before it could fully appear. What makes it even more cynical is that the myth was no longer being fed only by studio executives. Mass culture joined in with enthusiasm. When the internet later exploded with exaggerated folklore about his almost superhuman strength, it looked harmless from the outside, like a joke, a playful form of tribute, a collective wink. But internally, it worked in the opposite direction. It hardened the exact shell he may already have been trying to escape. The world stopped seeing a complex and sensitive man and started seeing something closer to a deity, a figure to whom pain, fatigue, loneliness, and the need for comfort were no longer allowed. And behind that facade, according to the source text's own logic, very earthly burdens were piling up. Grief for his brother, the lingering impact of personal losses, physical damage that had to be hidden from the cameras, production schedules that burned through not only the body, but the emotional reserves as well. A ring of agents, managers, and publicists telling him what to say, how to appear, where to go, what to promote, and what to keep buried. And through all of it, the almost absurd loneliness of a man standing at the center of attention while belonging less and less to himself. That is the real provocation in this entire section. Success is often sold as liberation. Reach the summit, we are told, and then life becomes yours. But in Chuck Norris's story, the summit of fame looks disturbingly different. The higher the brand called Chuck Norris rose, the more tightly the system fixed him into a single pose. Studios did not want a complicated man. They wanted a reliable signboard that did not feel too much, did not resist too much, did not age too visibly, did not tire too openly, and above all, did not insist on owning his own truth. This applies to the central paradox of his success. The world assumed he had won. Inside that victory, however, a new form of captivity was already taking shape. On the outside, there was fame, ratings, respect, and global recognition. On the inside, there was the exhausting realization that his own image was consuming him faster than any enemy ever could on screen. This is the point where the story stops being about career and becomes about the price of maintaining an image. Most people can endure hard work. Far fewer can survive the demand to live for years as an ideal hero, especially when they are forbidden from being anything smaller, quieter, and more real. If that myth had once helped him survive, it was now asking for a new payment. Not commercial, not promotional, personal, far too personal. Up to this point, Chuck Norris had endured nearly everything that usually breaks even very strong people. He had lived through the loss of his brother, the collapse of his first marriage, years of hidden physical damage, and a workload brutal enough to drain both body and spirit, all while keeping the same controlled public face the audience had come to expect. The public saw the mask and mistook it for invulnerability. What it did not see was the dangerous emptiness building behind that mask, the kind that grows when a man is asked to remain unshaken long after the inside has started wearing thin. The harshest part of this chapter is that he was not being destroyed by one dramatic catastrophe alone. He was being worn down by a system designed to consume him slowly. Filming schedules drained him. Agents, managers, and publicists dictated his rhythm. Even at home, even with family, he was no longer fully his own, because the industry had trained itself to see him not as a person, but as an endlessly functioning machine, expected to produce strength on demand, without pause, without protest, and without visible cracks. This applies to the most dangerous stage of fame. A person is rarely shattered by one blow. More often, he is stripped little by little of air, time, privacy, and the right to openly struggle. And the quieter he endures it, the easier it becomes for the system to pretend everything is perfectly fine. Then came the moment no discipline, no stoicism, and no public legend could overpower. Gina fell gravely ill. In the source text, this is presented not as another misfortune and not as a passing domestic hardship, but as the true rupture in the story, the family crisis that split his life into a before and an after. Suddenly, the whole Hollywood machine revealed what it really was beneath the bright packaging. Cold, efficient, and disturbingly indifferent to the fact that a man's private world was coming apart in real time. This is where the mythology loses its polish. The public could still imagine that the unshakable symbol remained intact. But from Norris's side of the glass, the situation looked very different. His wife was suffering badly, his family was under real threat, and the people who had profited for years from his image and physical sacrifice, according to the source text's own framing, did not rush to offer meaningful help. What was expected of him was the same old miracle. Get back in line, return to the screen, keep going as if nothing had happened. That is the exact point where success begins to show its most predatory face. And this is where the story stops being about celebrity and becomes unmistakably human. Not hero versus villain, not star versus rival, not aging fighter versus time. A husband versus a system demanding that he choose production over devotion. The conflict hits harder precisely because it is not theatrical. No explosive public breakdown, no screaming interview, no flashy scandal. Something colder than that. A man is made to understand that his family's suffering is not considered sufficient reason to slow the machine. This applies to the truth tabloids usually ignore because it is too ugly to package neatly. The biggest betrayals in the world of stars often do not arrive as screaming scandal. They arrive as dry calculation. Not a slap in the face, but a silent expectation that you will come back to work, hit your marks, and stay useful while your private life collapses behind the curtain. At that point, if we follow the internal logic of the source text, Chuck Norris understood something brutally simple. Hollywood does not protect its own. It uses them while they are profitable, and when real protection is needed, it offers scheduling instead of shelter. To outsiders, that might look like an ordinary conflict between personal life and professional obligation. To the man inside it, this was a moral trial of the highest order. Because on the other side of the scale were not numbers, contracts, or ratings. On the other side were Gina and the survival of the family itself. That is also where the entire meaning of strength changes. For decades, viewers had been trained to believe that real strength meant pressing forward, refusing to bend, taking the hit and still showing up, never retreating. But in this story, strength changes shape. The harder act is not returning to the screen at any cost. The harder act is abandoning the empire for the sake of home, not one more role, but the decision to become something Hollywood neither respects nor fully understands. A man who stays present when staying present is the most difficult thing of all. That is why his withdrawal from the machine is framed here not as surrender, but as the loudest action of his later life. He walks away from millions, from the familiar worship, from the aura of near-mythic status, and chooses care over applause. Presence over fame, family over the brand called Chuck Norris. And that may be the most uncomfortable blow of all for the industry that built him. The man marketed for decades as the perfect hero becomes, at the decisive hour, something greater than a hero. He becomes fully human. This applies to the highest price of fame. Everything he had endured before could still be buried under silence, discipline, and habit. Gina's illness ripped that mask away. It forced the question Hollywood always hates. What matters more, the career or the people you love? And in this version of the story, Norris gave the one answer the system never forgives, but audiences never forget. He chose his family. This is the point where the story stops being merely about family hardship and turns into a full exposure of a system that had been working against him for years in the quietest and coldest ways possible. In public, Chuck Norris was surrounded by smiles, handshakes, polished praise, and ritual talk about loyalty, friendship, and respect. Behind studio doors, a different game was being played. Executives tried to pit him against younger, louder action stars, pushed for manufactured rivalries, and kept nudging him toward the kind of tabloid warfare that sells tickets fast and rots reputations even faster. He refused to become a cheap scandal machine, and that refusal made him deeply inconvenient to the people who preferred noise over principle. According to the source text, the pressure rarely came in a clean, direct form. It came in the most poisonous form of all: hints, whispers, half-promises, and abrupt reversals from the same people who had once presented themselves as loyal allies. In public, they called him a comrade, a partner, almost a member of a grand Hollywood family. But the moment ratings slipped even slightly, handshake assurances began to collapse. Men who had proudly stood beside him at premieres and congratulated him under the flash of cameras suddenly became unreachable precisely when he needed time, leave, and ordinary human decency the most. That is the hidden cruelty of this section. No smashed furniture, no screaming conference room fights, no front-page scandal with names in block letters. Everything was quieter and therefore filthier. Cancelled meetings, unanswered calls, delayed responses, and the heavy realization that you were not merely being disappointed, but slowly erased. This applies to the kind of war where nobody fires at you directly. They simply begin behaving as if you are already replaceable. The conflict became especially sharp when the issue was no longer career management, but Gina. While he was trying to carve out time and protection for his family, the corporate machine, as the source text frames it, kept thinking in terms of schedules, ratings, and production discipline. And then came the darker signals. There were suggestions that he could be quietly supplanted, edged out, even stripped from the television structure he had helped build with his own labor and image. For another performer, that might have looked like an ugly business dispute. For Norris, it looked like a blow aimed directly at the final vulnerable core of his life. This is where Hollywood shows its real face. Not glamorous, but bureaucratically vicious. The public is encouraged to think that celebrity worlds collapse because of affairs, breakdowns, or loud self-destruction. But the ugliest damage often happens in offices, hallways, and the silence after a request for help. It happens in those exact moments when a man realizes that the people who made fortunes from his body, his labor, and his name are perfectly willing to classify him as expendable the second his humanity gets in the way of their timetable. This also applies to the most humiliating paradox of his fame. The more morally upright and disciplined his public image looked, the dirtier the backstage reality became. He was pushed toward fabricated feuds. He was urged to disparage peers. He was pressured to perform the arrogant, untouchable, heavyweight persona that tabloids adore and serious men usually despise. When he refused, he stopped being the system's ideal product and became its quiet problem. Respect made him admirable to the public, but inconvenient to the machine. At some point, that feeling of long-term moral corrosion stopped being ordinary fatigue and hardened into something much more dangerous for the industry itself. A clear inner decision to stop living by its rules. He had watched the Hollywood apparatus consume other gifted people and then discard them the moment youth, fashion, or immediate profitability began to fade. He understood far too well how such stories end. First, the machine raises you, then it uses you, then it empties you. Then it acts as though you were lucky merely to have been processed by it at all. And according to the source text, it was in this climate that a quiet but very serious revolution began inside him. From this point forward, his withdrawal can no longer be described as weakness, resentment, or the whim of an aging star. It was a slowly maturing rebellion by a man who had seen too much and learned too clearly what the glossy display window was really costing him. He did not stage public meltdowns. He did not run to television interviews with theatrical denunciations. He chose a method far more dangerous to the system. Inwardly, he stopped belonging to it. This applies to the moment when a man may still be standing inside the frame, but internally has already walked out of the empire that wanted to purchase not only his work, but his soul. And that is how the quiet rebellion took shape. Not as a sudden outburst, but as the accumulated result of countless small betrayals. Every broken promise, every cold silence, every pressure campaign designed to make him more useful, more obedient, more disposable. Every hint that he could be pushed aside, replaced, or erased. That is the real headline of this passage. Chuck Norris did not merely grow tired of Hollywood. He gradually understood that the only way to stop the machine from consuming the remainder of his life was to stop treating it as the center of his existence. By this point, the internal rupture had fully matured. Every broken promise, every polite betrayal, every unanswered call, every controlled humiliation had done its work. Chuck Norris was no longer interested in walking back onto the stage under someone else's script, no longer willing to hand the industry one more usable spectacle, and no longer prepared to turn his final truth into a marketable show. And this is where the story takes its most devastating turn. Instead of exposing everyone, he chooses silence, and that silence lands harder than any accusation ever could. The source text builds toward this moment as the true climax of his later life, not as a television ending, not as an elegantly edited farewell shot, as a private act of liberation. After decades of screen combat, after relentless pressure, after the exhausting war with the machinery around him, and after the ordeal inside his family, he prepares not revenge, but something much more dangerous to Hollywood. He prepares a gesture the system cannot sell, imitate, or own. This applies to the sharpest reversal in the entire narrative. A man with his history was expected to produce rage or confession, or at least a final list of those who had failed him. Instead, he chooses another weapon altogether. And with that choice, he rewrites the myth that had followed him for half a century. Only days before his quiet departure, in a hospital room in Hawaii, surrounded by family, he stood before a simple camera to record a birthday message. No polished studio, no glittering set, no protective Hollywood packaging. Just a man who had learned too much about time, the cost of fame, and the real weight of final words. The source text emphasizes that in this video he seemed to remove the armor of the unbreakable legend and speak no longer as the brand called Chuck Norris, but as Carlos Ray Norris himself. And this is where the scene becomes almost unbearable in its restraint. He does not list the studio executives who, in the logic of the text, had treated him for years like a profitable asset. He does not attack directors or producers. He does not stage a final trial. He does not spend his last moral authority trying to publicly destroy those who may well have earned it. Instead, he makes a move newspapers would call lethal in effect, even though outwardly it is nearly silent. He ignores the toxic Hollywood structure completely and speaks only to the people who truly mattered. This applies to a rare kind of strength audiences often recognize too late. It is easy to shout. It is easy to settle scores. It is easy to put names on the table and light the match. It is much harder, when you have every reason to be bitter, to refuse bitterness and choose gratitude instead. In that final message, if we follow the source text closely, 3 themes rise above everything else: his faith, his loyalty to his family, his gratitude toward those who stayed with him through hidden personal trials. That is why the recording works as more than a biographical detail. It cleanses the image. For the first time in a very long time, the viewer is not looking at a meme-made Superman, not at a television lawman, not at an invincible fighter, but at an elderly man with a clear gaze, a heavy lifetime behind him, and a startlingly calm heart. What matters most is that the text frames the scene not as weakness, but as dignity. He smiles gently, speaks softly, remembers the support of others, and makes it clear that their loyalty meant more to him than many could possibly understand. No hysteria, no theater, no attempt to squeeze pity out of the audience. Only a rare, almost disarming clarity of tone. And in that exact moment, the old legend of physical invulnerability begins to give way to another kind of legend entirely. One built not on force, but on inner steadiness. This applies to the emotional strike at the center of the block. He does not accuse, he thanks. He does not roar, he speaks quietly. He does not settle scores, he takes back ownership of his own story. And through that unexpected choice, he becomes stronger than any of the screen versions of himself that ever made him famous. When the world learned of his quiet passing a few days later, that birthday message instantly stopped being just a birthday message. It became a farewell people replayed with entirely different eyes. Millions suddenly realized they were not listening to an invincible childhood hero at all. They were listening to a complicated, exhausted, honorable human being who, at 86, refused to leave behind noise. He chose to leave behind tone, gaze, gratitude, and human warmth. That is why this episode functions as the climax of the whole story. Chuck Norris wins for the last time, not by returning to the screen and knocking someone down. He wins by refusing to obey the laws of the machine that had demanded hardness, emotional silence, and endless usefulness from him for decades. He rises above that system not through scandal, but through moral superiority. And that may be the most painful defeat Hollywood can suffer at the hands of one of its former icons. That is also where the final paradox reveals itself. For most of his career, his strength had been measured in impact, endurance, screen discipline, and that cold look which promised order to the audience. But in the decisive moment, it becomes clear that his deepest strength was somewhere else entirely. Not in muscle, not in technique, not in mythology. In the ability not to grow cruel. In the ability not to turn departure into a marketplace of resentment. In the ability to keep the final word from becoming a weapon. That is how a man half the world had long treated as a machine of force is suddenly transformed into a moral symbol. Quiet, warm, and almost impossible by the standards of the modern entertainment industry. When the video spread across the world, something happened that decades of blockbusters, television fame, and internet mythology had never fully achieved. People finally saw the man without the armor, not the screen judge, not the invincible fighter, not the walking emblem of American toughness. They saw an elderly man speaking with restraint, warmth, and unsettling calm. And that is why the public reaction hit so hard. Millions suddenly realized that for all those years, they had not only been watching a fist or a legend, but a human heart they had simply chosen not to notice soon enough. At first, the reaction looked like a wave of collective shock. People replayed the message not as a simple birthday greeting, but as something much heavier. Every quiet sentence, every gentle expression, every note of gratitude sounded different once the news arrived a few days later. What had initially felt like composure now felt like farewell. What had once sounded like the steady voice of a disciplined icon now sounded like a man who had already understood something final, and therefore no longer needed volume, anger, or one last performance of strength. This applies to the sharpest reversal in the ending. For most of his life, his image depended on distance. He had to remain above weakness, above complaint, above visible human fragility. Yet in the last stretch, it was precisely that fragility that made him larger than ever. The paradox is brutal and beautiful at once. The moment the myth of invulnerability cracked, respect for him did not collapse, it deepened. And this is where the story stops belonging only to Chuck Norris, because the public was not reacting only to a famous name. It was reacting to a truth people recognize instantly and still try very hard to ignore. We use celebrities as finished symbols. We take strength from them, comfort from them, inspiration from them, one-liners from them, memories from them, and then we recoil when a breathing, suffering human being suddenly appears behind the image. We like worship, we like jokes, we like myth, we like consumption. But do we know how to care in time, while the person is still here, still speaking, still human, before the voice becomes archive and the face becomes inheritance? That is the ugliest question hidden inside this ending. How many other quiet heroes are walking through applause with strength written on their faces, while some private battle is already exhausting them from within? How many actors, athletes, television figures, and generational idols are forced to carry the same mask, year after year, simply because the public and the industry made a silent agreement long ago? Weakness is not permitted to them. We talk about stars as if they belong to us, as if their duty is to entertain, inspire, remain useful, age beautifully, suffer privately, and never disturb our comfort with too much reality. This does not apply only to Hollywood. It applies to the entire culture of spectacle. We create idols, then act offended when they reveal a limit, then punish them for reminding us that the image was never the whole truth. We want famous people to be superhuman and permanently available at the same time. Always elevated, always accessible, always composed, always meaningful on demand. But no person can live forever inside someone else's expectation. Sooner or later, every public image begins charging a price too high for a private soul to keep paying. That is why the ending begins to sound almost like a moral testament. Not about martial arts, not about fame, not about ratings or old Hollywood glory. It is about the cost paid by human beings once they are turned into permanent symbols. Carlos Ray Norris moved from frightened boy to international icon, from discipline to myth, from private wounds to a public image that was not allowed visible weakness. And it is precisely his final message that forces the obvious truth back into the room. Behind every cultural giant, there is always a vulnerable, complicated, earthly heart still beating under the machinery of the image. That is why this last chapter lands so painfully with people. It reminds us that dignity does not always look like triumph. Sometimes dignity is a quiet voice. Sometimes strength is not impact, but gratitude. Sometimes the greatest rebellion is not exposing everyone around you, but refusing to let their cruelty poison your final words. And if this ending teaches anything worth keeping, it is not how to worship a legend more intensely. It is how to recognize the person in time. We are used to saying goodbye to icons as if they were monuments. This story demands something else. It demands that we stop treating artists as permanent machines of comfort and entertainment. It demands that we stop assuming fame cancels the right to fatigue, fear, pain, silence, and retreat. It demands that we learn to see not only the image sold to us by screens, but the fragile interior life that those same screens so often suffocate. And perhaps that is the true meaning of his quiet farewell. Not merely to move the world, but to force the world to finally look at its heroes as human beings before it is too late. Today we remember not only an action legend and not only a face of an era. We remember a man who, in the end, rose above his own legend. And perhaps the most honest response to that story is not only grief, not only admiration, not only the repetition of old myths, but a change in vision. Look more carefully. Listen sooner. Do not wait for the last soft message to suddenly understand that there was never only a symbol in front of us. There was always a living person. If this story moved you, please like this video. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss more powerful, honest, and unexpected stories about the people whose famous names often hid a very different truth. And be sure to turn on the notification bell so YouTube shows you our next videos first. Thank you for staying with us until the end.